Hi, I'm Tony Northup, and right now I'd like to talk about portrait lenses, what you should look for in a lens, what might push you to buy a new lens, or maybe what might make you ditch a lens that you currently have. People will get very excited about things like, well, sharpness. It's usually sharpness, but what I think are the most important criteria for portrait photographers are intimacy, like how close you need to get to your subjects and the look that the lens gives you. Style is part of it too. A lot of people will pick a lens and shoot so much with it that that lens, that focal length, the amount of vignetting and any kind of distortion that it might have, that all becomes part of their style. Accuracy is important too, especially with focusing accuracy. Lens can be wonderful, but if it's regularly missing focus on the eyes when the camera has confirmed focus, then it's going to be ruining shots and that's going to be costing you money. Holdability is important. Lightweight lenses mean that you can hold them for longer, you can shoot for longer, you can get more done. The big, heavy, fast lenses like a 70-200 f2.8 will wear people's arms out. You might not be able to shoot, and that means you lose money. Durability is important because as a working pro and you're working for years, you're going to be tossing things around and either it's durable or it will break. And if it breaks, then you end up getting it repaired and that ends up costing you money. All this boils down to profitability. How much will the lens make you? Will it make you more than it costs you to buy? And if the answer is no, then it might not be worth it for you to get it. And let me just say, especially with lenses, you care more about this than your clients do. I can't tell you how many portrait clients I've seen comment on how they loved a moment that was captured, but they never say, oh man, the contrast in that lens is so great. Wow, there's like no vignetting at all. That's so important to me. No, that's not the things that the client says. So photographers tend to get very analytical about the qualities of a lens because they look at a lot of test charts and stuff, but really it's the moments that you capture that are the most important things. But the lenses themselves can help you capture that or force you to miss it. I want to talk about zooms versus primes, a really important debate, especially in the portrait world. After all, you can get yourself a 70-200 f2.8, most wedding photographers do, or you can get yourself an 85mm f1.4. They both cover the same focal length. They could both take a shot at 85mm and f2.8. Therefore, they could produce very similar results, but at the same time, they can produce very different results too. And it can have a pretty drastic impact on how you shoot and the pictures that you end up sharing with clients. The top criteria here is going to be versatility. Zooms, of course, have more versatility. They can cover more focal lengths. A 70-200 can shoot at 70 or it can zoom in to 200mm. And if you're a wedding photographer, that sort of versatility can be really important because as a wedding photographer, part of what you're capturing isn't post pictures, but events. You're running around. You want to make a nice tight portrait while the bride and groom kiss. You can't necessarily do that. You can't necessarily get right up close to do that with an 85mm, but if you can zoom to 200, you can capture that. At the same time, if somebody is close to you, you could immediately zoom back and get the exact focal length that you needed. Primes photographers would say, hey, you need to zoom with your feet. You just need to actually get up closer. But in weddings, that's often simply not an option. But at the same time, if you're shooting mostly posed shots, or if it's a one-on-one type thing and you can get as close as you want, then primes can get the job done. And primes do have a lot of benefits. Probably the most important is just size. An 85mm prime is probably a quarter the size of that 70-200 there, and much, much lighter too. That means your bag will be smaller. That means as you're hand holding and shooting, your arms aren't going to get as tired. That means you can shoot for longer. It also might mean that you're holding it a little bit steadier and your results might be a little bit sharper. Primes also are faster at the same focal length for, the same price. The example I've been citing is the 85mm f1.4 versus the 70-200 f2.8. The 85mm f1.4, that f1.4 f-stop is much lower than f2.8. That means it's gathering 4 times more light. In low light, you'd get images with 1/4 the amount of noise, but also it would have roughly 4 times more background blur than that would at the same focal length. That means you have that option of really blowing out the background when you want to, and it can create really interesting and compelling effects that non-photographers notice and care about. That extra background blur can actually be a pretty big deal. Lastly, people think that primes are sharper, and that's often the case. Often they're a little bit sharp. I find that portrait clients especially don't care that much about sharpness. Nobody's ever like, oh man, I wish you could see my pores a little bit clearer. People don't really talk about that. I still like to take nice sharp portraits, but I'm just saying I don't think everybody cares about that. It's also not globally true that primes are significantly sharper than zooms. You could definitely find examples where that's true. But at the same time, zooms will allow you to absolutely nail the focal length. You could shoot at 88 millimeters. And with an 85 millimeter lens, you would have to crop a little bit. And that amount of cropping that you often have to do with prime lenses more than offsets the sharpness benefit. So I guess I don't worry about that much, especially with portraits. What about third-party lenses, like those from Tamron and Sigma? They're commonly available. They're generally really low priced. And if you look at lens reviews, they often outperform the Canon, Nikon, Sony, Fuji name brand lenses. So should you get them? It's a big debate. I think especially for beginning portrait photographers who have a very tight budget, are trying to get the most bang for their buck, they make perfect sense. Get a Tamron 70-200 instead of your Canon or Nikon one. You can save yourself $1,000 or even more, and that's going to get you shooting. That's going to get you making money. Often they're technically sharper. They will produce sharper results when you're taking pictures of the test lab, but at the same time, they can be flaky. While they will take sharper results of your test chart, when in the real world, you might find that they miss focus more often. And if something misses focus by even a tiny amount, it's going to be less sharp than any other lens, even a low quality lens. So while the Canon, Nikon, Sony, Fuji lenses might not be as sharp as the third-party alternatives, they tend to be more reliable, more precise, and that's because they have official support. When any of these manufacturers release a new camera body, they test it with every single one of their lenses that they plan on supporting. They make little tiny tweaks that make sure that both the lens and the body focus accurately, reliably, consistently. Time and time again, I've tried putting third-party lenses on, especially a new camera body, and experienced stuff from just like terrible focusing problems to straight up crashes. And that's a deal breaker for somebody who's shooting professionally. For that reason, I've been steering pro shooters more and more to use the name brand lenses for their systems. It's not just my own personal experiences, but we get emails like this all the time from somebody who can't get the Sigma 50 millimeter f1.4 to focus accurately. Like, why are they missing focus so many times? And it doesn't necessarily stop them, but it means that they have to take a few more shots. They're focusing and reshooting, and they're basically overshooting to be confident that they get a few shots. And if you're using the name brand one, maybe it wouldn't be as sharp, but you'd be able to trust it a little bit more. And at this point in my career, I think I'd probably go for the one that I felt I could depend on. Third-party lenses also lack pro support. So if you sign up for the Sony, Canon, or Nikon Pro support system, where they will repair stuff quickly for you, loan you consignment stuff, and give you discounts on repairs, that won't apply. So your Canon body can break and you can get it turned around in the next day. Great. But your Tamron lens breaks, Tamron might take weeks to get it back to you, even if it's a warranty repair. I've definitely heard tales of it taking more than a month. And what that means is, what are you going to do? Just do without it? Just not work? No, you're going to have to either buy a replacement or you're going to have to rent something for the interim. And on that first break, it can end up costing you more because you didn't have the option of pro support services. F-stop is something people consider a lot. Should you get the f1.4 prime? Should you get the f2.8 zoom? Or should you get the f4 zoom instead? Generally, these lower numbered values are better, but they also end up costing more. They end up being bigger and heavier. And let's take a specific example here. One of the most common questions I get is, should I get the 70-200 f2.8 or the 70-200 f4? The f4 is cheaper, it's lighter, and f4 will probably give me enough background blur for most situations. All that is true. And a lot of people get great results with the 70-200 f4 lens, and I encourage them to do that. But if you have the f2.8 lens, you can always shoot at f4. You have that option. You have the option to shoot at the faster f-stop, gathering more light and low light and blurring the background even more. And that's what it's about. It's about options. And you're never really sure what situation you're going into doing either portraits or weddings. So to be able to blur out the very distracting background can be a pretty big advantage and not something you should underestimate. So for that reason, if somebody has $1,000, they could buy a used 70-200 f4 with a name brand on it, or a used 70-200 f2.8 from Tamron or Sigma. I'd probably steer them towards the Tamron or Sigma. Even though I just discussed a whole bunch of drawbacks to shooting with the third-party lenses, the drawback of having a lower f-stop number might be bigger, but you really need to decide based on your own personal style and, just the way you shoot and what your requirements are. Stabilization can be in either the camera body or in the lens. And stabilization means that when you're hand holding, as most portrait photographers do, it will reduce the amount of shake that you have in there and frequently eliminate it. And you might have heard of the reciprocal rule, which tells you to shoot with a shutter speed faster than your focal length. So if you're shooting at 200 millimeters, shoot at 1/200th of a second or faster, and supposedly that will eliminate camera shake even if you don't have a stabilized body. It's largely, it's an oversimplification. You can still get camera shake, and you will get camera shake even beating the reciprocal rule. It depends on a lot of different factors, the sharpness of your body and lens, whether you're cold or not, how tired your arms are, the amount of wind in the area. Some portion of shots are simply going to have visible camera shake. When you have some amount of stabilization, it will eliminate even small amounts of camera shake and just give you generally sharper results in the real world. For that reason, for portrait photographers, I strongly recommend getting either a stabilized body with unstabilized lenses or an unstabilized body with stabilized lenses. Now, it's very common for people to use no stabilization. They will have, say, a D750 with an 85 millimeter f1.4 that has no stabilization, and they will get great results. You definitely can do that by using proper technique and overshooting a bit, knowing that some portion of shots are going to be a little bit unsharp and you'll just have to throw those away. Because you're going to get some shots that are good enough, and you don't have to get 100%. You just have to get those handful of shots that the client wants. It is something to consider, though. In some cases, stabilization will actually reduce the optical perfectness of the lens. A good example of this is the Nikon 24-70 f2.8. They had a 70-200 f2.8 for a long time. That was great. They recently released a stabilized version. They call it VR, vibration reduction. And everybody was amazed when they tested it and it was less sharp. Why would a much newer lens that's more expensive be less sharp? It's really because they built in the image stabilization into the lens. Image stabilization requires putting in some extra complexity and extra elements, and it generally reduces the optical quality of the lens. That's why most primes don't have stabilization, because if you're buying a prime, you probably care about the optical quality of the lens more than somebody who's shooting with a zoom. And that's just what it is. It reduces the optical quality a little bit and adds some additional complexity. But at the same time, it's going to save you so many shots that it's something that I really, really like to have when I am shooting any kind of portrait. I know because I shoot without it a lot. Like, I love the D850 and the 105 f1.4 from Nikon. It's a great combination. But I know if I'm shooting handheld, which I usually am, some portion of shots are going to have camera shake, regardless of my shutter speed. It's unavoidable. Let's talk about focal length. It defines the angle of view. Wide angle lens, you're zooming back. You're taking in a lot of the background, and if you want to fill the frame with your subject, you have to get close. This is often seen as a huge advantage. A lot of portrait photographers say they like to shoot wide angle, maybe with an 85 instead of a 200 millimeter, or maybe with a 35 millimeter, because it makes them get close. It makes them connect with their subject. If they had a zoom, they might be standing 10 feet back, and that can be a comfortable working distance. It depends on your style. Myself, I actually like to give my clients a little bit of space, especially for things like professional headshots. But if your style is connecting with the person, drawing out real emotions from them, you might be happier with a wide angle, not because of the image that it produces, but because it forces you to get more intimate with your client. 35 millimeter, I think, is a very modern focal length. And this applies for wider angles too, like 24 millimeters, largely because we all have these portable cameras, smartphones, and the focal length that they have is usually 28 to 35 millimeters. And people see these pictures all the time, and they are brutally honest. We see our Instagram feed, our Facebook feed is filled with pictures taken with this, and they're genuine candids. And as a portrait photographer, being able to leverage that feel is really valuable, because you can take professional posed portraits that still have the like honesty of that wide angle lens, and people carry that over. When they see it, it will feel more candid and more honest. And that's something that people really cherish nowadays in portrait photography. 50 millimeters is known as normal. This is what your eye normally sees. When you see a shot taken like this, it feels very standard, whereas 35 millimeters feels a little distorted, a little wide angle. Nothing about 50 millimeters will bump you. And that way it feels pretty honest too. When you go up to the very common 85 millimeter f1.8, 85 millimeter f1.4 portrait lens, to me, now you're getting into headshot range. You wouldn't want to shoot a tight headshot with a wide angle lens because people would end up looking cartoonish. But once you get to 85, you can start doing headshots and stuff, and it looks fairly flattering. With an 85, I think of it as like an intimate headshot because you are getting close. The features are still exaggerated a little bit. They're not cartoonish, but it doesn't have the very compressed feeling that, say, a 200 millimeter lens would. Once you get out to 200 millimeters, that's a great headshot length. I shoot that often, and it creates a very like glamorous, professional feel. The background will be completely blown out. People's facial features are compressed. Foreheads seem smaller, noses seem smaller, and with adults, that's generally flattering. But at the same time, it doesn't have the same depth. It does feel a little bit flat. Let's take a look at a lot of examples. Here's a portrait taken at 35 millimeters, and you can see it's almost a full body shot. I would never shoot somebody a tight headshot with 35 millimeters. It would look weird, but the wide angle allowed us to show her entire outfit and brought in some of the environment. Here's a picture of Chelsea taken at 35 millimeters. And you can see it shows the entire scene more so than a headshot would. And it also has that feel of just kind of hanging out with her rather than, hey, this is a posed portrait, which it is. It's not even the setting sun in the background. It's a strobe. But shooting at a wide angle like that helps to improve that feel of honesty. And as we look at this shot, you might notice right away it feels a little bit different. This is taken at 50 millimeters. We've zoomed in a little bit. It's compressed a little bit more. You're not struck by like, oh, hey, this is an exaggerated wide angle lens, nor is it super compressed. This is about what your eyes take in a scene, so it feels pretty natural. It feels pretty normal. Same with this. It's fairly wide angle, but their legs, their arms are stretched towards the camera, so there's some perspective, but it's not completely distorted. This is another 50 millimeter shot, and you can see because it is a tight headshot, my nose is a little bit exaggerated. It's a little bit too wide angle to be shooting headshots, but because we are shooting that close, the background blur is crazy. The background just completely disappears. This is obviously old. I had a goatee at the time. Here's another slightly more telephoto shot of the same subject from the previous scene. And you can see less background here. It's all compressed quite a bit more, but we're still taking in the entire scene. This is also shot at 50 millimeters. And you can see that background really disappears up close. But it's still showing some amount of context. You get some idea that she's in gardens with kind of a formal building behind her, and we're able to see the entire outfit. This is the type of situation that 50 millimeters is perfect for. Let's get into 85 millimeters now, zooming in a little bit tighter. This is shot with an 85 f1.4. Great for headshots. You can see you feel like you're close to her because you are fairly close to her, and yet the background still is able to just completely disappear. There's a lot of clutter back there, but you're able to pretty much hide it all, and you often have to do that. Same with this. The background wasn't great, so I was able to shoot wide open and blur it out. I could have decided to shoot at f2.8 or f4 and brought in more of those context clues to give you some idea of where she was. That's my choice as a photographer to do that. Here again, 85 millimeters, we're bringing in quite a bit of context of the surroundings, but we're still able to blur the background quite a bit and tell a story. Another example of a tight headshot at 85 millimeters. You can see it's something I shoot a lot. It's kind of the standard. And now we're getting into 200 millimeters f2.8. And you can see just flipping between this picture and the picture of Chelsea taken at 85 millimeters, they have very different looks. That's 85 millimeters and this is 200 millimeters. Here, her facial features are compressed more and the background is compressed more. You see less of the background because the angle of view is very narrow. There's no right or wrong answer. You might be saying, hey, I prefer the 85, I prefer the 200 millimeter, or I like the intimate look of 35 or 50. It's up to you what your shooting style is and the types of clients that you have. I wanted to give you kind of a tour of what I think these different focal lengths are good for. This is also at 200 millimeters in f2.8, and you can see the background kind of just disappears here. 200 millimeters in f2.8 at a wedding allowed me to maintain a reasonable distance from the couple on their dance while still really blurring the background out. And for things like business headshots, I'm frequently at 200 millimeters in f2.8 because it tends to be more flattering, and in environmental shots like this, I can dial up or down the amount of background blur that I want. Lastly, I'd like to talk about optical quality. Sharpness, of course, something can be less sharp or more sharp. Chromatic aberration, I'll show you that in just 1 second. Chromatic aberration will show little like magenta or green fringing around high contrast subjects. And contrast itself talks about how the camera will handle a lot of light, especially light that's shining directly into the lens. But let's look at examples of all three. Here's Justin's eye taken with 5 different 85 millimeter, about 85 millimeter lenses. And at first glance, you probably wouldn't notice any big difference in the sharpness of all of these. But if you look really close, you could see that, say, the Sigma 85 millimeter is way sharper than the Rokinon. But you have to be looking at his iris and his eyelashes, and then you might say, oh, okay, I see the sharpness difference. But is a portrait client ever going to care about this? I don't think that sharpness is really that big of a deal with portrait lenses, but you can always blur something. Like, it's easy to blur something. You can never add sharpness later. And there are times when a client might want to make a very large print, especially in the fashion and commercial industries, where they might make a wall size print, and having that extra sharpness will just flat out produce better results and get you more money. This is from Wikipedia, an example of chromatic aberration that's kind of exaggerated. But as you look at the lower example, which shows chromatic aberration, you see this crazy fringing going on. The upper example doesn't have this. Now, as a portrait or wedding photographer, if you wanted to correct that, it would be a real pain. You can do it. Lightroom has tools to go in there and remove that sort of fringing, but it's going to take you some time, and you're going to have to do it on every picture that's affected, and that's going to slow down your workflow. That means you're going to be taking less jobs and making less money. So picking up a lens that handles chromatic aberration well could pay for itself. Contrast, probably the thing that people think the least about. This is an example comparing the Canon 70-200 f2.8 Mark II versus the Mark III. Canon was widely criticized for not making any improvements in the Mark III version of the lens, except a slightly different color on the paint. However, when we tested it, we didn't find that because nobody else thought to test the amount of contrast that the lens had. But we shot with this for Mark II version of the lens for about a decade. And we knew that anytime we had the sun behind the subject, the flaring and contrast would both be terrible. When we tested the new lens, it handled that direct light much, much better. And as a portrait photographer, one of my favorite things is to shoot into the sun because it creates a very dynamic and contrasty situation. It adds depth and makes the shot more interesting. You get that nice like haloing and fringing and light filtering through somebody's hair. I just like the effect. So that's something I like to have in my tool belt. I like to be able to do that. Some lenses handle that better than others, notably the new version of the Canon, but a lot of the third-party lenses handled it better than the old Canon lens too. Technology will change faster than this video will, but I want you to consider contrast when you're picking up a lens. And if you borrow or rent something, maybe just take it out and shoot it into the sun and see what it does. If you do discover your lens has low contrast, it's not the end of the world. You just need to be aware of it. So maybe you avoid shooting directly into the sun, or when you do, you know you're just going to get that sort of Instagram-y, like low contrast look to it. Let's talk about focusing. Different lenses do focus better. It's not just the job of the camera to focus, but depending on the focusing motors in the lens, they might focus quicker, they might be more precise, or sometimes they might just straight up be imprecise. Some lenses are manual focus only, and I do know portrait photographers who always manually focus. And that can be okay, especially if you're shooting at f4, f8, it's not going to be a problem. But if you are shooting wide open, especially with like an 85 f1.4, you're going to find a very low percentage of shots are in focus, very low. Like for me, I tend to get 25 to 30% manually focused, like tight headshots where it's like very precisely focused on the iris, because at that range, the iris will be in focus and the eyelashes will be blurred, or vice versa. And the modern viewfinder systems and cameras don't really allow you to focus that precisely. So you end up taking a lot of shots and kind of moving in and out and knowing that you'll get some percentage, but manually focusing, real pain. I think for portraiture, and I definitely like to have the option of autofocusing. At the same time, I also like to have manual focus available, so I can, even if I'm autofocusing, if autofocusing fails, like in contrasty, like backlit situations or low light situations, I love to be able to grab the ring and just immediately focus before I miss the moment. Different lenses will focus faster than others. Typically, name brand lenses, Canon, Nikon, Sony, on those bodies will focus quicker than third-party lenses will. Focusing systems have to be reverse engineered by those third-party manufacturers, and for that reason, they just don't work as well. It's a big problem. And as a portrait photographer, you're going to miss some shots with those third-party lenses because they simply don't have the advanced focusing systems of the major manufacturers. Accuracy can also be an issue, as we've kind of discussed before. Sometimes it'll just miss focus by a little bit. The camera thinks it's in focus. It'll give you the confirmation. You'll have the focusing point right on the eye. You get the shot back and it'll just be a little bit out of focus. In summary, lenses are really important to portrait photographers. They will define your shooting style and the quality of images that you produce to a large extent. Of course, they're not as important as the person taking the picture. They're not as important as the relationships that you build with your clients, but they can make or break you. And if a lens ruins a bunch of shots because they're out of focus, that could really cost you, and I don't want that to happen. So I've tried to give you the criteria that I look for in good lenses with the hopes that you will take that with you and make educated choices.